All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Question Christianity. So, if you've been with us the last couple of weeks, we've been going through exploring the Bible and with the big question at hand of why trust the Bible. So, we looked a little bit at the Old Testament, and then the last couple of weeks we've spent looking at the New Testament. So, we will be continuing that tonight as we dive into what I find as some of the most intriguing information and evidence to look at for why you should trust the New Testament. So that's what we will be diving into tonight. If you have questions that come up as we go through this topic, please put it in the chat. Let us know what you're thinking. We do interact a lot with the comments. If you're watching from one of the streams that's further out in the interweb somewhere, you may need to find the main page on the Question Christianity page on Facebook. We'll be interacting with any of the chats that come in there. If you're in one of the further out links, I can't guarantee that we'll see. I try and watch those just in case. But anything you put in the main page on Facebook, we should be able to see. So with that, we will kind of dive in and
shout
get
out
started.
to Pete and Rebecca. He's not with us tonight, but just had his new son. Well, she did the work. She had the son, but congratulations to them.
Yeah, congratulations, guys. Hope y'all get some sleep.
Yeah.
It's about all you can wish anybody with a newborn. Well, great. Well, I'm sure we'll see him back at some point. So that's wonderful news, though. Okay, so let's dive back in here. So last time when we left off, we finished up last week by talking about Bible translations. So we spent some time talking about that, and I think we covered that pretty thoroughly. So this week, we're going to dive in and we're going to go through some of the more unique evidences for the New Testament. And I've kind of got these laid out in a way that I think most people will find interesting. So we're going to start with kind of the ones people write off quickest, and then we're going to kind of work to the ones that are hardest to write off. So, and I say that not to devalue any of the things, like the first one we're looking at here is prophecy, not to devalue it and say it's of less value, but in general, when talking with skeptics or people who come skeptically to the Bible, prophecy, like miracles, as we've discussed in the past, is going to be one of those things that's almost written off a priori. So it's assumed to be incorrect just because of the nature of it. So we're gonna take a look at a couple things here, and we're gonna look at a couple types of foreshadowing and a couple predictive prophecies. We're just gonna glance over all these things. We're gonna go through kind of pretty fast tonight. We're gonna kind of open them up a little bit. If you have comments or questions, though, feel free to interact, and we'll kind of try to expand some. But everything we're looking tonight, this is kind of where everything we've been looking at the last couple of weeks kind of begins to pile up. So we've looked at manuscripts. We've looked at how do we know the transmission of the text that got to us now? How do we know that's what was actually written at the time? How does that compare to other ancient manuscripts of around the same time? And so now that we're past knowing that we have an accurate transmission of the text, go back and watch the last couple episodes if you want to kind of catch up on that. Now we're going to look at, okay, what do we make of this text now? Is it something that's internally consistent? Is it something that can be trusted? Is it something that has coincidences that can't be written off? And we're starting this off with prophecy here. So real briefly, there's a couple different types of prophecy we look at. And a lot of these are the ones that are typically and consistently accepted by scholars as well as the early church in terms of looking at how the Old Testament relates to the New Testament. So there are lots of things the early church, as well as the current church, views as foreshadowings of Jesus' sacrifice. So one of the most obvious that probably the most people are familiar with is the Passover lamb. So during Passover, which was during the Exodus, as um, Moses and it goes to remove the people from Egypt, and Pharaoh won't let them go. So they have these plagues come upon Egypt. The final plague was one of death of the firstborn sons. And what the Jewish people were called to do was take a perfect lamb, slaughter it, and spread that blood over their doorpost in order to be passed over by death. So the Christians, early Christians and Christians today, believe that the Passover lamb is one type of symbolism of Jesus being foreshadowed in the Old Testament. You also see the same thing with an interesting character in the Bible called the angel of the Lord. This angel of the Lord, or angel of Yahweh, is probably one of the most fascinating characters in the entire Old Testament. He appears kind of mysteriously at different times. In Genesis, he appears. He appears again in the book of Judges, and makes multiple appearances, and each appearance has some weird characteristics with it. For example, he's referred to as the angel of Yahweh, but then his name will be interchanged directly with Yahweh in the text. So people who are speaking to this angel of the Lord will refer to him directly as God. So it's almost as if there was some kind of physical manifestation or form that was given all the attributes of God.
The indefinite article is something to keep your eye on there as well. So you might see references to angels, or even an angel from Yahweh or something like that. It's when the indefinite article is there, the angel of Yahweh, that it becomes specific and interesting to your points.
Yeah. And my particular favorite kind of occurrence here is in the book of Judges in chapter 13. There's a very interesting occurrence to Samson's parents, where this angel of the angel of the Lord appears and eventually ascends as a sacrifice in the offering they give to God. And they make a declaration after this that surely we've seen God, we're going to die. So it's very interesting. Again, these are kind of foreshadowings we see within the Old Testament. Some of these are directly correlated to Jesus by New Testament writers. Others are kind of inadvertently attributed to Jesus. And then the bronze serpent, another example from the Exodus, is this bronze serpent that is lifted up that saves the people after this incident of them being bitten by poisonous snakes.
How much do we have? A couple hours to spend on the bronze serpent today?
That'd be great, wouldn't it? You really could.
That's probably. I agree with you that as far as maybe convincing a skeptic, this may not be the most powerful, although it should not be dismissed either. I will say, theologically speaking, for those in-house, if you're not familiar with the link between the bronze serpent and Jesus, man, there is gold to mine in those hills. That is a really cool thing, and one that Jesus himself directly alluded to. So everyone knows John. I don't know if you were going to say this, but everyone knows John 3:16. But I wonder how many people know John 3:14 and 15, which comes right before that really sets up John 3:16. Maybe I'll just dangle that out there for you, and if you're at all curious, you can go check out John 3:14 and see what that says. I'd also go back. Well, of course, read John 3:14 and 15 and 16, and then go back and read about the bronze serpent in Exodus. Really interesting stuff.
Yeah, it is. That's a fun study.
I do like it. Yeah.
So, in addition to these foreshadowings, we also have what would be considered, more predictive and direct prophecies. So many of these were considered by the Jewish people to be prophecies referring to the Messiah, which they had anticipated coming. They anticipated a Messiah that was significantly different than Jesus, in terms of they expected a king to come in and be a military leader and immediately take over and lead them to victory over all their enemies, versus a suffering servant, which we'll kind of get to here in a minute.
And I think that would even be present tense, are still expecting.
Yeah, that's true.
Mm-hmm. So the idea of a Messiah that comes is extremely Jewish. That's an extremely Jewish idea. The question isn't whether or not there's a Messiah and that he's coming or has come. Well, that is the question. Has he come yet? That's the dividing line.
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of like Charles did with those verses in John a moment ago, we're just kind of going to dangle a lot of these out here for you to see. There were prophecies about divinity, about the Messiah being from the line of David, to starting out in Galilee. Miracles were supposed to be performed by this Messiah. He was supposed to be a light to the Gentiles. That's really interesting, and often overlook some of these prophecies that indicate that this wasn't just going to be a Messiah to the Jewish people, but also to the Gentiles or non-Jews. And then in Zechariah, there's even a prophecy about him entering Jerusalem on a donkey. And if you followed our last couple episodes, you'll see that, a lot of these books, we have good data to back up that they were written well before the time of Jesus. So the question then becomes, what do we make of the New Testament accounts? Are they reliable? Because we know that these prophecies were written many, many years before.
And, well, there's kind of two lines of arguments here, or maybe two different things to argue for. One is whether or not Jesus was actually the Messiah, but another one that is perhaps equally important and might come before that is, did he think he was the Messiah, whether or not he was? And so a lot of these things are just really interesting. I mean, if you've got him saying that he's, basically likened to the bronze servant, that he's choosing to enter Jerusalem on a donkey. Maybe he was the Messiah, maybe he wasn't, but it sure seems like he at least thought he was.
Yeah, I think so.
He's doing things on purpose that line up to these prophecies that all Jews understood. I mean, they were a people of the law. They were intimately familiar with what they'd call the law and the prophets. We'd call it the Old Testament. Intimately familiar with those prophecies. And sure, there was a lot of debate, but these prophecies were very well known, very well understood, and not misunderstood when Jesus tried to fulfill them, which is why so many people tried to kill him, because they knew exactly what he was trying to do.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're going to look at just a couple of Old Testament passages here. So in Psalm 22 is a very interesting passage that reads, "I am poured out like water, and all of my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death, for dogs encompass me. A company of evildoers encircles me, and they have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." So if you weren't familiar with the Bible, but had some passing knowledge of church, you may read this and think, well, this certainly seems like a passage referring to crucifixion. I would certainly tend to agree, and there's some interesting details in there. It's at least referring to someone being what's the word I'm looking for? At least held captive in some sense. And then you have the other details here too that are very interesting.
So let me slow pitch something to you. If I was in the first century and I wanted to reference Psalm 22, would I say to my fellow people, "Hey, you should go read Psalm 22 again. It's really cool."
No,
uh,
no, because the culture was very different. So you've got um, a much more audible culture. So it's going to be a group who knows these things by heart. Those, at least, who have studied it are going to know it by heart, or they're going to hear it read in the synagogue on a regular basis. So it's going to be things that they've learned, and it's also going to be memorized by the young children. So, they would take the children and they would start them off and they would begin learning. And those who had an affinity for learning and reading would go to work in the synagogues, versus those who maybe didn't do so good would end up being fishermen or carpenters or that sort of thing. No, we got some echoing. Let's see if we can fix some of these sound issues.
well, things sound fine on my end.
Yeah, I can hear you okay too. Let me check real quick here. If you had somewhere you were going with that thought as well, feel free
Sure.
to jump in, and I'll listen for a minute and see how we're sounding.
Yeah. So I think the place I was trying to get to is, well, first of all, verse numbering and psalm numbering came much later than when the Psalms and when the verses were written. That was actually a much later invention after the canon was closed. So the question still remains: how would a person in the first century reference a specific psalm from one to another? And the typical way that they would do that is to quote the first line. So, for example, if I wanted to say, if I was to throw it out there, instead of saying something like, "Hey, John 3," or "Hey, you remember what Jesus said in John 3," or "Man, Psalm 22," right? I mean, this seems like a really Psalm 22 moment. What I would say instead is, I would give the first line. And that was a typical way to kind of reference the psalm in entirety. Of course, you could quote the first line, but when you quoted the first line of a psalm, it's kind of like you were referencing the psalm in itself. Why is that important? Because not only is Psalm 22 really super interesting just for the content that it says, like he's poured out like water and is dried up, and that they can count all his bones were unbroken, and they divide his garments, which seem to really well line up with the crucifixion. But you have Christ himself, when you understand that historical context of referencing a psalm by its first line, you have Jesus himself basically saying, "Hey guys, Psalm 22," when he says, my God, why have thou forsaken me?" And although that line in itself does have some remarkable theological context to it, it's also as if he's saying, "Hey, Psalm 22 is really fitting my condition right now." So not only do you have the content of Psalm 22, but again, you have Jesus referencing it apparently to himself as he's going through crucifixion, saying, "Hey, Psalm 22, me right now. That's me."
That's well put. And we have a question here by Bruce as well about who are the dogs. And if you look at various translations, you'll actually see that depending on how the translation is done, some say the dogs, some say my enemies like dogs encompassing me. So the idea here is that like a pack of dogs surround someone, the enemies of the person in this passage are surrounding them like that.
Yeah, and it's so that I don't know that we can really say for certain, but there's certain loaded terms that seem to hold a little bit more meaning, and dogs is one of them. So it was not untypical for Jews to refer to the Gentiles as dogs. There's the parable of the woman. I actually forget what her specific needs was, but she basically comes to Jesus asking for help, and he says, "Should I give to the dogs what was meant for the children of Israel?" To the dog, meaning those not of Israel, the Gentiles. And of course she says, even the family basically brushes off the crumbs off the table and gives it to and then she uses kind of a slightly different word for dogs, like kind of like puppies or something like that. But anyway, for dogs encompass me. I mean, here he is being crucified by the Romans. I think it's at least worthy to say, man, there might be something there about a context of non-Israelites.
That's certainly possible as well.
Certainly, I think it would actually be I don't, believe it or not, I think the least likely interpretation is that he's literally talking about like canines.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why it's often very useful to compare multiple translations on this thing, or look at a lexicon and actually look up what the Hebrew word in this case means, and study a little bit on the grammar. That can help a lot with passages like this. Mm-hmm. All right, so I don't want to spend too much time on prophecy here, but real quick, another one that people should definitely look at when considering prophecy is, go in and read Isaiah 53. Try and read it with as clear eyes as possible, and then compare to one of the gospel accounts of the crucifixion, and see what lines up there. I think this is one of those that's so far beyond coincidence that I think this is the passage that is hardest for people to write off about the Messiah.
I once heard a story, so this is secondhand, and I can't remember who told it, so shame on me, but it was a story of a somewhat famous evangelist, and he was doing a college outreach and had someone from a Jewish background come to his Bible study, and he said, "Oh, you come from a Jewish background. Let me share with you Isaiah." And so he shared it with him, Isaiah, including Isaiah 53, and the student became instantly enraged and walked out saying, "How underhanded of you to use a trick Bible." He literally thought the guy had inserted messianic text into this Bible to trick Jewish people. And I think the guy said in closing, just like, "Do you have a copy of the Torah at home?" And he said, "Yes." And I think by his own testimony, he went home later and found his old Torah dusted off, and sure enough, Isaiah 53:5, just like that.
That's a pretty strong claim.
Gosh, what an interesting metaphor that is, just in general. Like here is Isaiah 53:5, and it was sitting in the Torah, unexamined and dusty, and it took kind of a renewed focus with this enlightened perspective, and wow, it's been there all along. It's been there all along.
Yeah, it's often called the suffering servant chapter because it deals with this prophecy for the Messiah that deals with him suffering and dying and something happening. It's easy to see that this very well could be interpreted as a resurrection in this passage as well. Or not in this passage I have here, I don't think, but later on. So, but anyway, it also deals very heavily with the gospel. So talking about, and by his wounds we are healed. So it deals with the whole redemptive message of Jesus on top of dealing with things about being pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. It's pretty interesting stuff. If you weren't to look into any other prophecies, Isaiah 53 would probably be the one to look at.
Yeah, and I remember when I first heard about this and came across it, not only is it one of the most longest and most kind of point for point lining up with a crucifixion type text, I thought, yeah, but maybe it's just being taken out of context. So I went back and read like chapter 4 or the chapter in the middle and then the chapter, and it's like, no, man, it is exactly what it seems to say. And it's not just Christians. For up until the first century. And then even after that, Isaiah 53 was understood to refer to the Messiah as an individual. And it wasn't till I think the 6th or 7th AD, so like 600 or 700 years after that, the Jewish community in general started to reinterpret Isaiah 53:5 into kind of more of a community, or maybe possibly a city, the city of Jerusalem. Those came after Christ for kind of some needed reasons. Like it was so clear that it's like, we got to come up with something different, because man, this is all too much like those Christians are saying it is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, it takes a while in reading prophecy to really kind of get the hang of what some things are pointing to. But I think anybody who's had any experience reading is going to be able to see this is pretty clearly referring to a person and not a city, as a lot of the modern Jewish interpretations kind of indicate. All right, so let's talk about the odds for just a minute here. In total, there are between 191 and 332 distinct predictions that are literally fulfilled in Christ. So those are some of the things we just talked about. The list given, as well as a lot of these specific pieces indicated in. So we're not talking about vague stuff along the lines of, he would be a nice guy kind of stuff. We're talking about, hands and feet being pierced. We're talking about riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. We're talking very specific things. And conservatively, we've got at least 191 predictions in the Old Testament that are directly fulfilled in Jesus. And Peter Stoner, in this book mentioned here, calculates the odd of just 48 of these being fulfilled by one man. So we're talking about a quarter of the ones that most people would agree on being at least resemblance in Christ in some way. And so the odds of that you can find here, which are 1 in 10 to the 157th power. And we've talked previously in the miracles episode a little bit about odds, and we're talking about, you write it off as 0 chance after somewhere in 10 to the 48th. And we're talking about the odds of a quarter of these being fulfilled in Jesus, or any single individual being 1 in 10 to the 157th power. That's pretty crazy odds.
It certainly seems reasonable to believe that it's not chance.
Yep, I would agree. But let's, don't take our word for it. Take a look, dive in, see what you think. There's certainly some great resources out there on this sort of thing. I cover some of those in the sources at the end. So, want to take a little bit of a different look now that we've kind of dug into prophecy a little bit. So let's think about some factors that might make a source more or less trustworthy. So I would certainly consider some of these things. If looking at a historical source, I would find some of these things to be indicative of having a source that is at least trying to convey honest information. So some of these things listed here, including embarrassing details, including difficult things that may have been said. We all say things that maybe are a little difficult to understand without the whole context around them, but including those kind of things, including facts that would be atypical if it was invented. So things that, you wouldn't usually hear about, like trying to think of kind of a modern example. One will come to me later, maybe. Including detailed places, people, that sort of thing. If you're looking at multiple accounts, you would expect there to be some divergent details, because you're not going to expect everybody's perception of an event or their narration of how things played out to be the same. So you're going to see some divergent details, but they shouldn't necessarily contradict. And then, there's going to be things that could be embellished that obviously, wouldn't be embellished if it was a true account. So these are just a few of the things that I think would certainly make a source a little more trustworthy. So first thing we're going to look at is embarrassing details. So in the gospel accounts specifically, we have lots of embarrassing details. So the writers who are recording these early biographies, which are a little bit different than our modern biographies, but by all accounts, the gospel accounts are an ancient biography. And in recording this, they leave in a lot of details there that wouldn't necessarily be something you would leave in if the account were trying to make the story sound a certain way. So the apostles in particular, Jesus' closest followers, were kind of constantly dim-witted. They were missing the point of what he was saying. They were misunderstanding things. They were putting their foot in their mouths constantly in terms of a lot of the interactions they had. They were fairly uncaring at times. Jesus asked them to stay awake and pray, and they fell asleep repeatedly. They experienced a lot of rebuke by Jesus. They were cowards at times, and they were also doubters. If you're writing a story about the leaders of the church, and so we're talking about accounts being written very early in most of the lifetimes when these guys are still around, and so they're first or being narrated to somebody else, and in that they're being recorded as cowards and doubters. Even most of us, if writing a biography for, say, an autobiography for a parent who's passed away, if we're writing a biography for our passed away loved one, we're probably not going to include a whole lot of details about them being cowards or doubters. After these events move far enough along, you begin to forget some of the bad things. You begin to forget some of the negative emotions you associate with somebody, especially after they're dead. But in this count, we have lots of these negative attributes that are being written about in the gospel accounts.
It seems unlikely. One of the accusations is that the disciples did what they did or said what they said about Jesus and his resurrection to kind of make themselves seem famous or to kind of get credit. But you kind of can't have it both ways, because you can't say that they did what they did to try to aggrandize themselves and then make themselves look like idiots in the gospels that they're spreading around.
Yeah, because from a personality standpoint, you're going to have one or the other. You may have some mix over. You certainly could have somebody who's trying to appear humble, but that's also not going to be your narcissist who's writing all this for money or power. In addition, they included a lot of stuff about Jesus that would be atypical if this was someone they were trying to tout as the Jewish Messiah. If they were trying to build him up to be, this is the Messiah that we've been waiting for, they're probably going to include a lot of detail. They're probably going to not include a lot of the details that they did, such as him not being believed by his own family. He was called a drunkard at times because of who he was associating with and what was going on. He didn't do miracles in his hometown. And then they included a lot of difficult sayings as well that not only from a present tense are they hard to kind of understand why it would be said, but even for the listeners at the time, some of these things were difficult sayings. For example, if the apostles were trying to start a religious or military revolt, then, including Jesus's sayings about do not resist an evil person is not exactly something they would include in their propaganda, if you will. Also the things Jesus said about making the commandments harder to follow. So it wasn't just committing an act, but the thoughts of a murder or adultery were the same as committing them. So, they included a lot of things that if you were trying to record accurately what was actually being said, what was actually done at the time, these are certainly possible. If you were writing later and trying to glamorize things, these would probably be things you would leave out. Any other thoughts there, Charles?
Just one in general, which is I like that we're going through these criteria. Well, see, maybe that's not the wrong term, but my point is that they shouldn't be. How did you term them? What was the way that you put it? That these are indications of something being more reliable, something like that?
Right. So certainly these kind of things would be indicative of truthful or more honest attempt at writing versus something that was intentionally fictionalized and glamorized.
Right. So the more of these you have, the more you can have confidence in the reliability. But it's not a prerequisite. So certainly, I mean, if you just think personally, you can write something down that is true, and it doesn't have to be embarrassing. You can't put that as a prerequisite. Well, Charles wrote me a letter, but he didn't say anything embarrassing in there, so I can't trust anything he had to say. Or if you were testifying in a court of law, you don't have to say I was walking down the street naked. You don't have to say anything embarrassing for it to be reliable. But it does work on the positive side. So if you do include something embarrassing, then that does kind of lend to it, so to speak. The reason I say that is because there are some schools of thought where they're going through the Gospels and they're stating these things, and it's like they have this checklist, and it's like, well, there's nothing embarrassing in here. There's no Semitic traces. There's none of this. And it's like, well, we can't trust that one, and then they throw it out. You can't do that.
No, yeah, that's a good point. Even without any of these, I think we would still have some good reasons to believe that the writings were trustworthy.
Right.
But having these things in addition,
yes, it's
certainly,
like a bonus point.
Yeah, lends us some extra credibility here.
Correct. Especially when those things, just at another thought, especially when those things seem to be peppered throughout the text. It's not just kind of one at the beginning. It's like they're peppered throughout, and so kind of in between, it also tends to make some of the other sayings more credible, because like you got embarrassment here, you got embarrassment there, and kind of in between you have like a narrative that seems to be going through. It seems to give more credibility to the narrative in general when you have, and of course, as we're going through it, embarrassment's not the only one. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. And another one is, careful details. If someone's trying to accurately record historical events, they're hopefully going to provide careful details. And we do find that in the New Testament a lot. We find that there are very careful details. There are also unlikely details that are often included, such as women who were valued less as a witness in court. They were the first ones to find the tomb, but that detail is still included. In addition, we have a Jewish explanation thrown in the Gospels that the Jewish leaders were saying, oh no, his disciples came and stole the body. If they were trying to dishonestly prove the resurrection, this would probably not be a detail that would be included in there. It's certainly possible, but in general, if you're so set on proving something and you're willing to be dishonest to do it, then why not throw out something like that discredits what you're trying to say?
Yeah, why set booby traps for yourself?
Yeah, exactly. So we've got a lot more to get through, so I'm gonna move kind of quickly, but please, feel free to pause the video, take a look at some of these. If you want references, let me know. So, also, some of these things really pull together into something that's called undesigned coincidences. So, this goes a little bit beyond what we've been looking at, but these are coincidences that really have a ring of truth to them. And it's because of the nature of these. So, for example, we'll get to a couple examples here in a minute, but we're looking at 4 different gospels in the New Testament. And if you cross them over one another to see how they kind of lay together, do the accounts of particular events line up in a way that makes sense? Are those divergent details we talked about? Do they diverge in ways that make the story different? Or do they diverge in ways that make sense either from different perspectives or different writers giving different details?
And by the way, there's kind of a magical medium there. If they were too like each other, almost like word for word, then it really kind of seems like, well, one is just a copy of the other, or is so close that it really does seem like it was really just one source. If they're, of course, that they're too divergent, and where they're basically giving counter details, then you don't want that either. But what you have in genuine independent eyewitness attestation is a general consensus from different perspectives. So it's got to be different enough to where it really does seem like it's from a different source, but of course it has to line up with the general flow of the account.
Right. So, a good example of this is looking at, eyewitness testimony in cases of missing persons or violent crimes or whatever you will. So, if a detective lines up and hears the exact same account from every single witness, people have questions. Was this conspiracy? Did these planned and within a reasonable degree? So somebody saw a dark car, somebody saw a green car, or somebody said it was around midnight. Other person said it was late night or early morning. You're going to have details that are going to be different, but are going to converge in some ways. So we're going to take a look at just a couple examples here. So there's a question of why does Herod Antipas ask his servants about Jesus? So this is from Matthew 14. And at the time that Herod Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him." But we find the answer in a different gospel. So he's asking his servants about Jesus in this passage in Matthew. And we don't have any idea why he's asking his servants about this, or even how we kind of come of this information. But we find out in the Gospel of Luke that one of the followers of Jesus was the wife of Herod's steward. So you see here in Luke 8:3 that it actually gives us kind of the missing piece of information from Matthew. So we find out not only how the writer of Matthew could have obtained this information, but we also see that there's a good reason as to why he would have asked this of his servants. So there are a lot of these. I'm going to give some resources at the end that really allow people to dig into these. We've given one. There are dozens of these undesigned coincidences that cross over between Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and even Acts. and the details crossover in that wouldn't have been not very, very great detail. And you can just look up Peter Williams and New Testament on YouTube, and you can really dig into this. But he goes into the linguistic evidence for the New Testament. So when you look at the New Testament, you have a name frequency within the New Testament that lines up with exactly what you would expect in that region at that time. So when we look at all the other writings from other regions, you would see a different name frequency if it were another part of the Roman Empire somewhere. However, the name frequency lines up perfectly with if these people were from Galilee and Jerusalem. So, in addition, really interesting fact is the common names, the most common names that were given, such as Judas and Simon. These were very, very common names. And so the individuals, when mentioned, who were a Judas or a Simon, were given qualifiers on their name, while the less common names, such as Lazarus, were not given any qualifiers. So it's to not only identify who it was, but the writers were familiar with how common names were. And so the ones that needed qualifiers were given qualifiers. Also, very interestingly, we find that apocryphal documents, so later books such as the Gospel of Judas, and one other one I'm trying to think of right now, just as an example. I think it's the Gospel of Mary as well. Anyway, some of these apocryphal writings that claim to be Gospels, but as far as we know, they were written much later. We're talking 3rd, 4th century. These documents actually don't contain the same patterns of names that would be consistent with that region and that time.
They have almost no names in them. They have almost no names. It's like, yeah, one of them has like 2 names, and one of them's Jesus, and the other one is like Nazareth, which they kind of confuse. And so it's just remarkable.
Yeah, they just leave out all those kind of details, and they just don't line up.
On a personal note, I think this one particular, you really have to watch Peter Williams go into it in detail to give it justice. But man, this is just it's a ball of fun to watch him go through this. It's really remarkable. I mean, he goes, you might ask yourself, how would we even know? And the answer is, well, basically they had ossuaries, like bone boxes where names were written on them. So you can go back and you can find out. It's just like going to any graveyard. You can go to a graveyard right now, and if you were careful and you kind of wrote down, look at what dates, you could find out, when someone was born, when someone died, and you could catalog that, and then you could make a little chart and said, wow, in this region, because that's where the bone boxes are, or in our case, the cemeteries, like in this region in 1943, it looks like there's a predominance of these names in this area. And that is I'd say that's virtually impossible to replicate without doing some type of a catalog like that. And we're talking about people who didn't have Google, right? And didn't have access to go do a survey of all the bone boxes in their areas while they're inventing a narrative. You can come up with a narrative and you can use common names, but can you do that in statistical relevance? Can you get the most common name right? Will you use it correspondingly? We get the first most common name. Will you put that in your fictional document most commonly? Will you get the second most common name and use it the second most commonly? Will you use the qualifiers? That's insane. You can't replicate that. The only way that you could really get that right is to literally use the events and names at that time and just faithfully record it. It's, in my mind, that's just a slam dunk. You can't do it any other way.
And if we saw that with one gospel, that would be amazing. But we see it with all 4.
That's correct.
And the book of Acts.
That's correct.
So I mean, like you said, this is just a lot of icing on the cake.
It just
Like,
blew my mind because you think, I mean, it's one of the things you probably pay the least attention to. I mean, sure, you read the name like John, John the Baptist, John, uh, uh, whatever. You're reading names, but when do you ever think, wow, there's like 3 different Johns in here, and you think about how statistically relevant that might be to actual place proper nouns back in that time. It's crazy. It's crazy.
it is. And in addition to that, you have place names more prevalent in the canonical gospels. So you see that, in the gospels they mention places too. So these are somebody who are trying to at least describe actual events.
Why would you do that if you were inventing stuff? Why would you include all those details if it was fictional? Again, it's like you said before, you're just creating areas where someone could disprove you.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you're just writing down what happened. Then it just becomes, it doesn't become an invention, it becomes second nature. Just like we would, man, I remember that time I was down at Chick-fil-A and we were like, you're saying Chick-fil-A, you could relate the story without saying that, but it's just a natural part of you related. And we were at Chick-fil-A, it was, it was in the summer. I remember it was super hot. I was
And I
with
mean,
Caleb. Yeah, go ahead.
in modern times, to do something like that, we have Google, we have the Yellow Pages, we have all kinds of resources that could help an author to do this. So, to create historical fiction that encompasses a lot of the place names. I guarantee you, if you look at most of the historical fiction today, you're not going to find a ton of accuracy on place names and events and people and that sort of thing. Certainly not the same frequency of names in the region. That's a link that very few modern writers would even go to, because it's a detail that doesn't seem important, because your average reader is not going to pick up on this kind of detail. But in this case, you have a situation in the first century where you have writers who don't have the means, they don't have the ease of writing or transmitting material in the same way. They certainly don't have the means of research. And in general, these are people who probably haven't traveled a whole lot in their life. So they're
Right,
familiar with the
right.
events around them in that area. And we find exactly what you would expect if that was the case.
So so we've got 4 different gospels written by 4 different authors. And they're not all written in Jerusalem. Some of them are written like in Turkey. So how do you get a gospel written in Turkey that understands place names, architecture, correct percentage of proper noun usage, distances, botany, currency, political structures? It's like, how do you get that right about a different place? You're not Googling it. Most people, like you say, don't travel. It's like, man, that's really hard. And how many of those things that have been included have currently been shown to have been wrong? None, not one. There are some that we haven't verified yet, but that's increasing. That list is getting smaller. The people used to say there was no evidence of Pilate, and they were right. At that time, there wasn't. We found one. And so that list of things that we haven't verified yet is getting smaller, and everything that has been verifiable has been shown to have been accurate. No misses yet, 100% on all those details, and this variety of detail. I mean, and some places in Acts they're describing the depth of a port in water. Like, how deep is the port? Like, why would you do that? Yeah, it's all right. It's all
Yeah,
correct.
it's crazy details. You'd almost have to, I mean, I don't see any other way but for you having to have been there.
It's certainly, any other way would certainly seem less probable than just a biography of what happened. I mean, you can come up with a theory like aliens. Well, maybe aliens told. Yeah, I mean, that's possible. Well, is it
Sure.
possible? That's another explanation. But it seems like any other explanation other than these people were just writing down eyewitness testimony. Gosh, that seems like the most likely one, except if you're unwilling to accept the intertwined miracles. This is an a priori rejection. It's like, if it didn't have miracles in there, this would have been a slam dunk hundreds of years ago. But because it happens to contain miracles, it's automatically assumed to be false. And now we're looking at explanations and grasping at straws as how and why that could have happened.
Yeah.
God is possible, miracles are possible. Yeah, so
that's why we covered miracles first.
right. Good point. Great point.
So one other thing I want to talk about real quick before we end up, and we could spend a ton of time on this as well. But for me personally, I think one of the biggest questions is, would the apostles die for something they knew was a lie? So we've talked a lot about determining if the New Testament texts are reliable in terms of what they're writing and what they're recording. Even if you reject the miracle claims, you have to look at this and go, these people were writing something that was at least accurately told. The story was accurately told. And then we get to the question of, well, why would they add miracle claims? And if they did, how far would they go to maintain that? And what we find is that the apostles did everything they could to not reject anything they had recorded or written in that time. They would not reject the claims of Jesus. And church tradition says that almost all of the apostles were martyred in some way. However, Dr. Sean McDowell goes into a lot of detail in terms of the historical research he did to look into how much of these church traditions are reliable. And what we find in looking at that is we have some that have a very strong probability of having been martyred. We have others that have a moderate probability. And then we have a bunch that we don't know. Could have happened. There are certainly church traditions that say it happened, but they're 1 or 2 centuries later. So it certainly could be made up to glamorize things or to embellish the story to a certain degree. But with the ones mentioned here, there's a very high probability, based on the historical records, that Peter, Paul, and this is the Paul who used to be Saul persecuting Christians, so the convert, was most certainly martyred. James, son of Zebedee, and then James, the brother of Jesus, the same brother who apparently rejected Jesus's claims before his death. And then we also have a moderate probability of Thomas and Andrew also being martyred. So the question you have to ask yourself is, it's one thing for somebody to die for something that they don't know is a lie. So for an Islamic terrorist to blow themselves up for something that they don't know is a lie is on a completely different ballpark than for someone who clearly had the ability to know whether something was a lie, to not reject it and to die for it. Because given the growth of Christianity, the impact on the Jewish community, the impact on the Roman community, if any of these individuals had rejected it, we would most certainly have a historical record of Paul recanting or Peter recanting, because they would have used this as fuel against the church to crush the growth of Christianity. But we don't have that anywhere. Instead, we have individuals who went to a brutal death for what they had absolute time and ability to know whether or not it was true.
In the field of New Testament studies, academically, both on the skeptic and believer side, the fact that the disciples really believed that Jesus has risen from the dead is not it's not really an open topic. It's closed, and the vast majority of scholars in this field believe that the disciples truly believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, that doesn't they don't all agree that he did. They all agree, or they virtually all agree, that the disciples believed he did. It's like, man, so you got to take that, and then you look at the other things like the details in the Gospels, and the details they wrote down, and their acts and their lives and their willingness to die. It's a compelling fact. But that doesn't mean, just because it's academically settled, doesn't mean that you won't hear it on the street. And see, that's kind of the problem. It really is a sort of ignorance. People just say, oh, the disciples, they stole the body, or there's conspiracy. It's like, oh, I mean, there's a lot of rumors going around, a lot of thoughts, but academically, it's not viable. There's a reason why it's a settled point of history.
And so what we've kind of come to through this is we found out that the manuscripts we have are certainly very close to what was actually written. And then we've hopefully made a compelling case that there's some information here between prophecy, between undesigned coincidences, between the details and embarrassing details of the gospel, as well as the people that were willing to take this to their grave. There's certainly enough information here for someone to consider that it is possible that what they wrote, they strongly believed, and they tried to convey what they believed and what they saw. Honestly, I think there's a compelling case to be made for that as a strong possibility. And I think to write it off is to largely do so on the basis of there are miracle claims here, so I'm throwing this all out. But I think we have to ask, why would these people die for what they so strongly tried to accurately record? So, and it's been a few weeks since we came around to this, but for Christians, one thing is, how do we respond to the kind of objections to the New Testament's reliability? We're running just a little bit over, but we're right here, so I figure we'll finish this up. First off, you always want to understand what a person is actually saying and what they're looking for. And you can use questions to do this. So when someone questions the Bible and says it's not reliable, or I don't trust the Bible, or it was lies written down by men many years ago, some good questions to ask would be, what makes you think the Bible is unreliable? Find out what they actually think about it. Which one of these areas that we've discussed is the most problematic for them? How have you explored its reliability? What have they studied? Do you find the whole thing unreliable or only certain aspects? This gets very much to that issue we were talking about. Is it the rejection of miracle claims? Is it rejection of what they believe certain Old Testament passages are teaching? Is there anything that would change your mind about the reliability of the Bible? So again, are they rejecting it a priori based on miracles? Like, if you took all the miracles out, I'd believe it. Or is the rejection based on something else? How much of the Bible has to be true for Christianity to be true? It's an interesting one that started some fun conversations for me.
That is a great one.
How should we assess a historical text? How do we go about looking at it? What should we look at? Do you believe there is any truth in the Bible? Again, these aren't gotcha questions. These are ways to keep a conversation going with people, to talk about these issues, and to do so respectfully and in a way that people want to engage with.
I love in the book Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, when he first encounters the Christian in that book, I think his name is David, which, by the way, it's a true story. Of course, he sees David reading a Bible, and he launches into this, a small little series of facts of why the Bible's untrue and you shouldn't trust it and you don't believe that thing. And I think David's response is just kind of gently close the Bible and say, "Go on." Which is great. It's like, because what he wanted was dialogue. So it's like, you got something to say here. I'm going to close what I'm doing and go ahead. keep going. Tell me everything you have to go, because I'm willing to listen, and I'm comfortable enough to do that without getting upset, and just, I want to enter dialogue with you. By the way, that conversion, I think, took several years.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's not going to be, you're not going to slam dunk anyone into conversion, most likely in a day. You're going to need to dialogue and you're going to have respect, because you need a relationship.
Exactly. And to carry on conversation is the goal. The goal is not to win and have someone confess to be a Christian at the end of a conversation with them. We,
Yeah.
as Christians, as the church in general, have beat people over the head with that for so many years and so strongly that it's been one of the greatest sores people have had against Christianity for many years. And that is nothing like how the Bible told us to make disciples. A disciple is not someone you've met on the street once and handed a tract to. A disciple is someone you've walked alongside with, you've built relationship, you've had conversation, and you've learned even together with each other. So, I think we as Christians need a mindset change if we're going to hope for people to even consider what we're presenting.
Yeah, 100% agree. That's the model, that's the goal. But I also want to say, on the other side, that doesn't mean, I once heard, you've got to earn the right to speak, and there's truth to that. But that doesn't mean that you have to be someone's best friend before you can talk about religious things. You just keep it natural. You can, and I have had conversations with people that I've just met and then I never met again. It came up naturally. I had a natural conversation. I didn't try to convert them and make sure they were converted on the spot before they left. I followed the dialogue where it naturally went. So you can have dialogue with people, but yes, probably the most healthiest way is to develop relationships and well, that's why you got to keep it respectful. So discipleship.
Yep, absolutely. Well, we ran a little bit over tonight, but wanted to finish up since we're already 4 episodes in with biblical reliability. As you'll see, I've listed just a few of the resources I used for compiling some of this information. So these are just a few and very kind of street level resources that quote the academic literature, but they put it in a presentable way. So checking out any of these would be a great next step if you're really interested in reading or listening to some more of this information.
Awesome.
So,
well done, Caleb.
What was that, Charles?
I just said well done. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for joining me. So everybody have a wonderful night and God bless.
All right.